I know the day and time of my death, but I'm not worried. It might sound strange, perhaps terrifying to most people, but for me, it's a certainty I accept with a calmness even I find unsettling. It all began a few months ago, on an ordinary night that completely changed my perception of reality. It was a Wednesday. I remember it clearly because the silence of the night was interrupted by the monotonous sound of the television. I was in my apartment, alone, with the light from the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. That's when my phone vibrated on the coffee table. A message appeared on the screen. No sender, no number, just words. April 24th at 11:45 p.m. Be ready. I frowned. I thought it was some kind of joke or spam, but something about those words unsettled me in a way I couldn't ignore. I locked the phone and tried to forget. There was nothing special about that night, except for the growing unease in my chest. The next morning, the message was still on my mind. While having my coffee, I revisited the idea that it was just a prank. Maybe some friend with a twisted sense of humor. I decided to investigate. I asked everyone I knew, but no one seemed to know anything. The response was always the same, confused looks and denials. The following week, things got worse. I started noticing strange patterns around me. People staring at me for too long on the subway, shadows disappearing in the corner of my eye, strange noises at home at night. Every little event seemed to conspire to remind me of that date, that dreadful warning. By the third week, I began to have dreams, vivid dreams, so real that I would wake up sweating and with my heart racing. In the most recurring one, I was in a white room with no doors or windows. In the center of the room, an old clock with hands pointed exactly at 11:45 p.m. The ticking sound echoed like thunder in my ears. When the hands finally met at the top, I woke up. Every time. I decided to seek help. I talked to a therapist, told him about the messages, the dreams, the signs. He listened patiently, jotting down notes in a small notebook. In the end, he said stress might be creating connections in my mind, that my imagination was exaggerating things. For a while, I believed him. But then, the messages returned. This time, they were more detailed. Photos of my own apartment, taken from angles I had never seen. A photo of my bed with a dark figure in the corner, almost invisible. A message, we are always watching. Fear became my constant companion. I started locking all doors, covering the windows with heavy curtains, avoiding unnecessary outings. But the feeling of being watched never disappeared. I began hearing whispers, low and indistinct, seeming to emanate from the walls. That's when I realized I couldn't run. The date was approaching, and something inside me said that when it came, I would be ready. Or perhaps I simply wouldn't have a choice. Things got even worse when I started finding objects out of place. Small changes that drove me paranoid. A moved glass, a door I was certain I had closed, open again. One night, I found my own portrait scribbled on a sheet of paper left on the living room floor. At the bottom, written in shaky letters, "You know what's coming." I didn't tell anyone. I was sure I'd sound like a lunatic. I started watching my apartment like a paranoid guard. But every night, the strange events continued. It was as if something or someone was toying with me, testing my limits. One day, while cleaning the apartment, I found an old recorder hidden under the couch. It wasn't mine. It was covered in dust but worked perfectly. There was only one audio file on it. When I pressed play, my own voice came through. "I know the day and time of my death, but I'm not worried." That's what I said. But I had never recorded that. The voice continued, describing the events of the past few months with chilling accuracy. At the end, the voice stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing. And then a single whisper, 11:45 p.m. Be ready. My heart nearly stopped. I threw the recorder away, but it kept playing for a few seconds before shutting off on its own. It was a warning, but also a confirmation. This was real, and the date was drawing closer. My heart pounded erratically, so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. My hands trembled as I stared at the recorder, now lying still on the floor, like a dead animal, yet still menacing. I wanted to run, to flee that room, maybe even the city, but something kept me rooted there. It was as if I had to face it, no matter how terrifying it was. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I picked up the recorder from the floor with hesitant fingers, inspecting it. There was nothing unusual about it. No loose wires, no obvious trick to explain what had just happened. The voice, cold and inhuman, still echoed in my mind. The date is drawing closer. Without thinking too much, I grabbed my phone and searched the internet. The date mentioned, January 18th, was less than a week away. I tried looking for any event, news, or even catastrophic predictions associated with the day. Nothing relevant came up. It was just another ordinary date on the calendar for the rest of the world. But for me, it was a harbinger of my end. I decided to review the rest of the tape. I adjusted the recorder to where the message had stopped and with reluctance pressed the play button again. The sound of static filled the room for a moment before the same voice emerged once more. "You still have time," the voice said, "but it's running out. Be ready." Be ready? How exactly? It was clear this wasn't just some psychological trick. It was something bigger, more sinister, but I still didn't know what. I noticed that the voice wasn't just cold. It carried a certain satisfaction, as if it enjoyed watching me struggle against my own anxiety. I turned off the lights in my apartment that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the voice repeated itself in my head, the message twisting like a perverse echo. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I started by investigating the recorder. It had appeared randomly in a box of old belongings, but I couldn't recall how it had gotten there. I called my mother, asking if she knew anything about it. After a few frustrating attempts to explain what I was looking for, she vaguely remembered seeing it in the basement of my grandfather's house years ago. "Your grandfather loved old recorders," she said casually. "It was part of his work, but he never mentioned anything special about that one. Why are you so interested in it?" I swallowed hard. I didn't have the courage to tell her the truth. "Nothing important," I lied. "Just curious." My next stop was my grandfather's house. The place had been empty since his death, but I still had the keys. Inside, the smell of aged wood and old books enveloped me, bringing a suffocating nostalgia. I went up to the attic, where he kept most of his things. Stacks of boxes were everywhere, gathering dust and blending the past into an organized chaos. In the farthest corner of the attic, I found something peculiar. An old journal with a worn leather cover. The first pages were filled with detailed notes about acoustic experiments. My grandfather seemed obsessed with the idea that certain sounds could alter human perception, perhaps even access parallel dimensions. The last pages, however, were different. The notes became frantic, filled with drawings of abstract shapes resembling spirals and concentric circles. Repeated phrases appeared here and there. "They are listening, and time is irrelevant to them." The final entry was even more alarming. Written in uneven handwriting, it read, "If you hear them, do not answer." I closed the journal, a chill running down my spine. Was this a connection, or just the ramblings of an old man? I didn't know, but the mention of hearing couldn't be a coincidence. When I got back home, I noticed something strange. The living room window was slightly ajar, and a cold draft swept through the room. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert, and that's when I saw it. A mark on the wall, as if someone had scratched through the paint. It was a symbol, a kind of spiral that looked eerily similar to the drawings in my grandfather's journal. The sound of static filled the apartment. I looked around, my heart racing, until I realized it was coming from the recorder. It had turned on by itself, its buttons flashing as if possessed by an invisible energy. My breath caught in my throat as I approached. My heart pounded harder with every second as I held the recorder, which felt heavier in my hands than it should. I decided not to listen to it anymore. I turned it off completely and locked it away in a drawer. But what it had left with me couldn't be buried so easily. The date of my death, engraved in my mind like a sentence. In the days that followed, I dove into research, trying to find any logical explanation for what was happening. I went through my grandfather's journal again, analyzing every phrase, every scribble. He mentioned echoes from beyond, energies that fed on time and fear. It was as if he had been trying to map an invisible territory, something only he could see or feel. But one thing was clear. Everything seemed to revolve around sound. The night before the marked day, the silence was absolute. Even the constant noise of the city seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. At 3 a.m., exactly as predicted, something changed. The recorder, locked in the drawer, began to emit a low static. The sound seemed to ripple through the house like an invisible wave. I walked toward it hesitantly, feeling as though I was being drawn by a force beyond my understanding. With trembling hands, I opened the drawer. The recorder was on, but this time there was no voice, only static. That's when I realized it wasn't just random noise, it was a pattern. A kind of coded message I couldn't understand, but that made my heart race. And then the sound stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Deep, final. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall had stopped. The world around me seemed frozen in time. From the corner of the room, something began to emerge. It was an indistinct figure, a silhouette made of shadows and static. It had no face, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. "You knew," said a voice, but this time it wasn't coming from the recorder. It was a whisper directly in my mind, chilling my spine. "And now, you know why." The figure extended its hand, and in that moment everything made sense. The recorder, the messages, the symbols, none of it was a warning. It was a contract, something I had agreed to without realizing it. The date of my death wasn't a predetermined event. It was an appointment. I took a step back, but the figure moved closer, slowly consuming everything around it. The last thing I felt was the ground disappearing beneath my feet, as though I was falling into an endless abyss. And then, nothing. If you're reading this, know that the recorder might still be out there. Perhaps it's waiting for you now, ready to start it all over again. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.